That's why I like it.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. And thank you for coming, and sorry to being a little bit late. I would like to introduce today the third session of the panel discussion of the ICD. The title we have chosen today for this week and the next week is The Collapse of Capitalism, with question mark. So I would like to show you a video and then to introduce the discussion, and then just to give space to you, to your thoughts, and to the discussion.
A global outcry against corporate greed has risen up in almost 1,000 cities worldwide. People have taken their anger to the streets, saying their governments have been taken over by big business. The Occupy Wall Street movement began in New York, quickly spreading across the US to Los Angeles, Denver and Washington, among others. It's since gone global, with Asia joining in the demands for change. In Europe too, hundreds of cities are taking part in the protests. Well, let's now take a closer look at what's happening around the world with our correspondents. We've got Marina Portnaya in New York, Ivor Bennett in London, Daniel Bushell in Brussels, and Irina Galushko in Madrid. And first we go live to Marina. Now, Marina, there's a huge turnout in the streets there in New York. What are people saying there now that their movement has become so big?
Well, as you mentioned, this turnout here in New York is the largest that it's been in the past 4 weeks. Let's remember, it was 4 weeks ago when the Occupy Wall Street movement started off here in Zuccotti Park, where I'm standing by Wall Street. Now, what these activists are saying right now is they feel that their movement is persevering. They feel that they are moving forward in a victorious kind of way now that the Occupy movement has gone global. Thousands of people have been in and around Lower Manhattan showing their support for the Occupy movement or taking part in it all day long. Thousands, as I mentioned, in the park where I'm standing. There were hundreds that went to Chase Bank earlier in the day to withdraw their money and close their accounts. Hundreds, if not 1,000, have gathered in another area of Manhattan in Washington Square Park to also echo the sentiments that have been voiced by the activists of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And just about an hour ago, we received reports that at least 20 people that went into a Citibank to close their accounts were arrested by plainclothes police officers.
So, as you probably saw, today's subject for discussion, as well as the title that we choose, The Collapse of Capitalism with the question mark, is intentionally thought-provoking. In the past few years, we have all experienced the succession of events and government choices that have led to one of the deepest financial crises ever within the industrial Western world. Countries are now edge of collapsing, and unemployment rates are reaching somewhere levels close to 40 or 50%. The new generation is finding harder and harder to envision a future of economic stability for themselves and for their future families. A couple of months ago, a large group of Spanish youngsters occupied the main square of Madrid, La Puerta del Sol, to express their disappointment at the fact that the unemployment rate of people under 30 years of age had reached a peak of 40%. All they were asking for was the possibility to build a future. So similar protests occurred in New York soon after and have started to spill over into several US cities and other places in the world. Occupy Wall Street is a more inclusive movement compared to the Spanish one, and it consists of younger and older people. The latter expressed their dissatisfaction of harshly criticizing the power of banks under the motto, "We are the 99%, but still we cannot decide on our future." So, although the Spanish and US movement had different objectives, the underlying dissatisfaction of both protests had the same roots. On October 15, the movement had spread all over Europe and also to some countries in Asia and in Africa, affecting 952 cities in 82 different countries in total. Protests were mainly against the bank system and the financial world. Some of them, such as the Rome protest, resulted into violent acts. So the squares of the world, Zuccotti Square in New York and the Puerta del Sol in Madrid overall, iconographically represent the concept of democracy that civilization gave birth to a long time ago. In ancient times, these squares were places where citizens could gather to democratically discuss and contribute their options, their opinions, on issues such as their welfare and view on the functioning of the state. Or at least the definition of democracy wanted the square to be such a place of discussion. In comparison to the flat squares, this democratic concept has been lost today, as decisions are made by leaders in skyscrapers and big buildings, far above the citizens who are affected by these decisions. It's a contraposition between the top-down democracy versus the concept of democracy as a public space of discussion. So nowadays, several aspects of people's lives depend on supra-state entities such as multinational corporations and international banks. The institution of economy decide on the well-being, employment, dreams, and hopes of the people. The problem is that these institutions don't discuss citizen well-being or in open forum. Rather, they do so in stock exchange headquarters. This is a modern example of anti-public space, where meetings are held privately behind closed doors and can be seen as the complete opposite of such forums, where in flat square people take decisions together. So even if protesters don't propose a concrete solution to the faults of the system, other than the destruction of the system itself, it could be argued that what they are unconsciously looking for is the ancestral need to get back the public space. This would have been the agora, the public space of assembly, where citizens can make decisions about their future together with the political leaders. So to make you reflect further on this theme, I would like to stimulate the discussion about this. Thank you. So is anyone interested in commenting this or give a different point of view on this?
I'd like to say, as a rather seasoned protester, that most of the protests that I have fought in, they didn't really reach the dimensions of the Occupy Wall Street, and I would definitely concur in saying that they are dragging the whole thing down to the public space and protesting against the up in the tower decision making, where nobody is involved in what they're actually decreeing for the people. And
anybody else?
Yeah, well, on the topic of protesting in general, I've only been to one protest, and that was when the UK government increased tuition fees to £9,000, which is something I felt very strongly about. So I went along to this protest, and it was very interesting because, in general, it was, I think, quite a negative thing for a lot of people because there was a lot of violence, a lot of disorder, and it damaged the reputation of students, it damaged the cause. But I actually found it a really positive thing myself in terms of my own engagement with that particular topic. So, I mean, in terms of this protest, healthy expression, or access to violent antagonism, I think I would say that protesting is actually is fine and should be encouraged. That was just my point.
Yeah, well, like Tom said, I thought I should answer the question as it's up there: healthy expression or an access to violent antagonism. I think that protests can get violent, and some people do go to protests for the wrong reasons and aren't really there for the cause. But I think the wide majority of people do go to protests for the right reason. I think it's a really positive thing that these protests are taking place all around the world, and sort of protests seem to be spreading, like we had them in the Arab Spring, and not just there, we've got them in a lot of Western countries. I think it shows that people our age, young people, are still very interested in politics and are very active. And I think that's good. And I mean, you know, a couple of weeks ago we were talking about the role of technology, and it shows that people are still getting out there and doing things in person. Admittedly, these protests, a lot of them are organised online, but the main protests themselves happen, you know, in reality. And I think that's good. And I think it's good that young people like us are trying to change the world. So.
Okay, first to Sarah.
I think I agree with both Tom and Mikey on that they can be a healthy expression, but over the summer in London, there was riots, and they started off as a protest against some person's death. And then actually, 3/4 of the people that were protesting didn't even know the person, didn't even know the story, didn't even know anything, just kind of took it as an opportunity to steal a pair of trainers. So I think it begins as a really healthy process, but then unfortunately, in the world that we live in, it's too much of an opportunity. Well, I mean, it's certainly in England, it's too much of an opportunity to smash a couple of windows. I mean, the London riots were ridiculous, and they were talking about sending the army in to quell a couple of, well, thousands of 14-year-olds. So I think, like, protest begins as a healthy thing, but unfortunately, with the type of people and the world that we live in, it just turns into a ridiculous thing where the protests aren't even about anything in particular anymore. And that's just coming from personal experience with the London riots a couple of months ago.
I think what's really interesting about the London riots is a lot of people complained about the fact that it was all about consumerism and nobody was interested in a political point. It was just about stealing brand name trainers or whatever. But at the same time, I think that reflects really accurately on our society, that our society is very much centered around consumerism, and therefore, of course, what people feel that is going wrong, if they don't have access to these things that they feel that they should have, of course that's what they're going to grab for, and I don't think it's right, and I'm not I don't approve of thieving and rioting and whatever in that sort of a sense, but I think to say that it's not necessarily a political statement is perhaps wrong.
Yeah, I was going to come to the protests in London and compare them to the Wall Street occupation, because in some ways they are similar. Like the Zuccotti Park is a kind of public-private space which is being occupied, and where the Bloomberg has the right to actually drive them out, but it is in contrast to the London protests. The cause seems so much more bigger than this little incursion on private property, and also there have been cases of violence in the Occupy Wall Street movement, but they mainly came from the police and not the other way around. So that's actually what is building up so much support around the world, is that the people are actually being attacked by the police, and people are being misinformed through the conventional media, but on the internet they paint a completely different picture. So I think that's something to think about.
I would like to first go back to what Giuseppe said in the beginning with the public space and with the Agora. It made me think of, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the theory of the public sphere by Habermas, who is actually saying we need a public sphere for people to get involved, we need a democracy to get back to its roots, and then how do we create actually this space? The thing is, we go from the postulate that people have the knowledge to get involved and that people have the will to get involved, which is to my mind not given anymore. It's not. We shouldn't take this for granted. Most people don't have necessarily the knowledge, and I totally agree with Sarah on her comment about a protest in London. We need to see to what extent this protest can be constructive. The first part is maybe engaging in Facebook causes, tweeting about something, rather than going to vote, actually, because people are moving away from classical ways of expressing their political views to new ways, and this is just what is happening, so we should embrace it, I guess. But then the last part is that they go to the streets, and then what happens? Is there anything close to a coherent point of view? Is there anything close to a coherent political program, stance, or something like that which can be taken forward? I think we're not yet up to that point, and most protests don't have that, and most protests just dissipate or just extinguish by themselves because they don't have this kind of core ideals is just about expressing discontent. And of course, discontent has to be expressed, but if we don't have a leader or some kind of a way to express something more worthwhile in the long term, it's not going to actually change much.
I would maybe take that a little bit further and suggest that not only do the protests that we're seeing at the moment, including the London riots, not only do they not have that political push behind them or a central figure to lobby, as it were, the protests are very much about an expression of unrest, dissatisfaction, but they don't offer any real solutions. There's no alternative, there's no real practical program of how we can facilitate change. It's more just, flexing our democratic arm, which, while it's a positive thing, it's going to affect very little change in that way. So I totally support that point that, for these protests to go any further, then they really need to have somebody pushing it at a higher level.
I just want to make a short statement. I think we shouldn't concentrate just on the London riots. Okay, it was an important event, I would say, in 2011. But if we, for example, have a look on the on the demonstrations in Madrid starting in May, they started very peacefully and actually running for a month and were most of the time peaceful. I mean, we should concentrate on the other side as well, on the police. You said, I would totally agree with you. Some or many protesters are getting provoked by the police. They don't want to run a violent demonstration. They actually want to make their statement, and I think it's a very important thing that people go on the street and yeah.
In listening to this, it made me think how protests, it's this kind of catch-22 in a way, because they almost need a form of institutionalization in order to push agendas forward, in order to have a unified voice, in order to have an agreed meeting space. This idea of public space in some ways needs to be institutionalized. And then once there's this sort of idea of a unified agenda, the protests almost, you start to have protests against the protests in a way. And once you elect a leadership, it's, is this leadership effectively representing our cause against the established leadership? It's this kind of weird push and pull. So I would agree, actually, that I think protests have a very limited sort of ability to affect change in this way, because there's just a limit to how organized they can be. But that's not to say that the simple need to express initial discontent, to come together and to meet people that are people that you wouldn't normally come into contact with, but there's this shared sort of discontent, in some ways is a very human thing. And having this, as was said, this public space, this need for public space in order to be able to do that, but also to have the institutional framework around it, where there is a tendency to turn into a mob, there is a tendency to riot once it reaches its certain level, and the need for police that don't provoke, but to at least maintain this idea of a public space as a peaceful expression of discontent, but then to have a framework around that, which is to use, if this is within the context of a democracy, effectively a republic, actually, to have people that know how to really use that system, because I think the next step for this is actually, at least when it comes to the Wall Street protests, is actually campaign finance reform, because it's not just the bankers, it's not just the politicians, it's the kind of relationships that exist that I think campaign finance reform can really effectively address, and it won't be addressed in this kind of forum. It's always I think an effective first step in then garnering this sort of support and channeling it into the next step, which is a more effective sort of focus on what actually is the problem, as opposed to just screaming haphazardly at it.
Just want to add to what my colleague just said about the effects of this protest. Of course, like, in my opinion, any kind of protest is a healthy way of expressing yourself. It's your democratic right. But let's relate to the other main issue, the collapse of capitalism. Well, the problem with this protest is that actually they have an effect. They make people more scared than they are. And what then people do? Go to banks, withdraw money, and make the financial crisis even bigger. So I think in our case, despite, let's say, the public violence that a protest can lead to, it can lead to also, how can I say, worldwide desperation. And that's a real effect. And media is the perfect channel to put all this scare in everyone. And the protests are just the beginning. So this is my opinion. Thank you.
I wanted to express the point that we should take into account that protests in different regions, in different countries might have different, not reasons, but for example, in most of the European countries, you have a problem one day and the next day already you have protests, probably not as big ones as London Riots, but taking, for example, in my country, Ukraine, I think that people will wait and wait and wait, like one day it happens and then we'll still think that something will change, and then, okay, 1 week after, okay, probably will protest. So I'm not saying that people are different, but they are like mental like attitude to their ability to change something is different. And yeah, so I was just that this might the point was that I think that this might have different. Maybe the cause for protest might be one, but the attitude and the effect, the back after, if there will be a decision, it would be different for all countries. And
yeah, I wanted to make a point in relation to yours. I think you're right to link protests and desperation, but I think protests have to be seen as more the product of desperation rather than a cause of it. And in relation to Sarah's point, yes, protests can only be just the beginning, the first step. And if the movement is big enough, then granted something larger will come of it, but that will need some form of leadership, and there's always the risk that that leadership will not necessarily be properly representing the views of the majority of the protesters. But on the whole, like, there is no universal view that's held by the protesters. I was studying the Occupy protests recently, and they had a BBC interviewer who went around and interviewed many of the protesters there, and he said that he interviewed 50 people and he got 50 different reasons why they were there and why they were protesting. Often it's just an expression of anger rather than any real direction.
Yeah, I would say that the Wall Street occupation qualifies as big enough to move something, and it's big enough because people feel affected. Everybody feels affected, except for, of course, these 1% who make up the richest people in the world. And you say that a demonstration, a protest has very limited possibilities. I say the possibilities are exponential with the size. I say, now that we have brought it actually to a discussion and trying to formulate our ideas in front of a camera, this makes a very good effect of this protest.
First, I would like to say that I agree with you when you say about leadership, that sometimes we need one, but sometimes it's even better to not have one because you don't know if it'll be a real representative of what you're trying to defend. And I would like to say that I disagree with most of the things that have been said, like the collapse of capitalism is not going to increase because people are withdrawing money of the banks, and that yes, for me, protesting, it's a healthy thing. And the fact that we put together healthy expression on access to violent antagonism, it's for me not the right question, because you cannot just put demonstration and violence on the same sentence, because it's already mixed the two concepts together. And demonstrating is not only about violence, it's also about expressing yourself. And yes, sometimes it can be violent, and yes, sometimes violence is necessary when you want to succeed to reach your objectives. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes you're pushed to use violence to defend your rights and to defend what you want, because the other side will not just let you have this, because this is not in their interest for you to have liberties, freedoms, and maybe some rights that you want to have. And capitalism today, it's something that is not working. Most of the people, the powerful people, they already know that, and they just don't want to stop it, because at some point it's interesting for them to keep this system alive. And I think that what people are trying to do, it's healthy, because it shows that today still people can go into the streets and demonstrate and still express what they are not agree with. And I didn't think that will happen again, because I think that people today, they are falling asleep and just being comfortable with their lives, and they will not protest anymore. And I'm happy that it's not the case. And instead of talking about this sentence, maybe we should ask ourselves what we can do to help them to have concrete objective and how to reach this objective, because they want something that we all want. Mainly, I think that a place for us to live better, and a place where we can express ourselves, and a place where the money is not ruling the world. So mainly, I think we all have to fight for this, and we can question the way they are doing it, but maybe we can question ourselves what we are doing for them and what we are doing to support this movement. So that's it.
Truly French speech there. I really enjoyed that. It was just a thought, really, that only occurred to me literally just now, and it was so obvious I thought I'd bring it to people's attention, that we're sat in a city, in a part of the world, in part of a country that wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for protests, and protests being considered healthy expression. Because had the protests in Leipzig on East Berlin not broken out over 20 years ago, this institute would probably not be located on this street here now, because of what those people did and the regime that their protests brought down. So I just thought it was quite salient and quite interesting and important.
I've never had a camera in my face before. When you guys are talking about protests, I kept thinking about grassroots protests. The Zapatistas, for example, they started protesting when Mexico adopted the NAFTA. And it wasn't, some say it wasn't so much as a protest as much as a rebellion, but it was a protest. And they were successful because they were able to use media to get the world to listen to them, which is something I don't think any of these protests are doing properly, because if you have violence in the streets and communicating it to the media is not enough. You have to get people to listen to you too. And I'm nervous and forgot what else I wanted to say too. And for me, that was the difference, that the Zapatistas were successful, because Chiapas is partly autonomous now, and let's say the Tarahumara in Peru, which I think they're gone now. But yeah, I'm done.
I would agree with my friend Darnell that a lot of movements in the 1960s were quite effective to their aims and objectives. And I think that there's been a recent field of study in academia about what makes protests successful, because there is this romantic ideal of what the protest is and what it should be, and I would agree that within that protests should not be linked with violence, and in fact those are two quite different things. That riot and protests are two completely separate subjects, and I think within the reality, I think a real question is why do then they so often go hand in hand, and I think that this is a subject of very relevant sort of research, and I would just posit that within the 1960s, within the people that were behind Martin Luther King, and of course that was actually also a fractured movement as well. There were people that weren't in line with Dr. King's methods and with his peaceful movement. Some people wanted to be more violent, wanted to be that the situation called for violence, but within this, there was some very clear objectives of separate is not equal, that all people have a right to vote within that constitutional context. So there were clear objectives, which I think I would argue is absolutely necessary with the protests, with bringing so many people together, with so many varied points of view, that there needs to be some very clear marks around which to surround themselves. And a very clear criticism of these movements is that there is no clear objective. It seems that, would the objective be to take down the entire system of capitalism? I don't even know what that would look like. Or are there other sort of smaller objectives within that? They seem yet to emerge, and I think without those, these protests have very, very limited sort of ability to affect the system against which they're railing. So.
An example of a protest without violence, and Gandhi and his protest. It was amazing. He didn't want from the beginning no violence, and he got India free. So I think he's the perfect example of a protest without violence. Thank you.
I'd like to get to the question, the collapse of capitalism. I'd like to react to what you said, Maria. That's why I asked about your name. I forgot again. I don't think there is something wrong with capitalism, because think of what this world has witnessed so far. There has been so many political regimes, or this is not a political regime maybe, but capitalism seems to be functioning. That's what I think, and we are where we are thanks to capitalism. That's what I think. If I look at you, I can see that you come from different countries, but most of you are from Germany, from France, from Great Britain, and what I want to say is that you haven't experienced any other regimes but democracy and capitalism. You haven't experienced communism, as me, for example. So I think capitalism is still the best way to go, but we have to change something about that. And what I think, I'm always trying to come up with some concrete ideas. I think that if we make our political representation change something about the bank sector, because not the bankers are bearing the responsibility for the economic crisis. It's businessmen, actually. Those people who actually employ people, and these people faced the economic crisis most. So if the governments make the bank sector more responsible for what is happening all around the world, I think it could be a solution. Thank you.
I think even though there's not one crystal unifying cause of these protests, I do think they do have some aim. I don't think it's just people wanting to go to the streets with no sort of cause. I think the main thing is just, again, is inequality, and especially as these things are taking place in supposedly advanced Western democracies. I think these people are just coming out and saying, why is our society in crisis? Because people are basically, these bankers are playing a gambling game with our economies, and there's people, there's still I'm from London, and I've read there's a campaign in a local newspaper there called the Evening Standard about how homelessness is actually increasing at the moment, and I think supposedly we're like an advanced one of the most advanced cities in the world, in London. I just think that's shocking that homelessness is actually increasing in our city. So I think generally what these people are protesting against is inequality, and there should at least be a level where the poorest people in society at least, have a home and have a place to live. And I think that's what these people are protesting against. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's like we're waiting for a standard of decency, like a decent standard of living for everyone in the society. I think it's pretty condescending to avoid the topic of violence. Violence can bring legitimacy to a movement, because people are actually giving up on their basic. Okay, that's a bit harsh what I'm going to say, but standards of civility to express their anger, and they have something to express. So I think we shouldn't delegitimize violence. I think this violence should actually, these protests have been going on for years now. I don't know, it's been countries. Developed countries have experienced violent riots for a while now, since 2005, and since much earlier than that. And it should press governments, elites, anyone who could be interested, who could bring change, any citizen, to think about change, to imagine what could be next, how we can change things and make the world more human. And stuff. It might be idealistic, but yeah.
Okay, guys, so unfortunately our time is over, and many people still wanted to say something, so I just tell you that we can carry on the discussion on our Facebook page, on Twitter, on the Cultural Diplomacy News, and I would like to thank you all for being here today, and I give you appointment to next Monday at 5:30. We have the second part of our discussion about the collapse of capitalism. Okay, thank you very much.